Well,
cane and little thing to pick stuff up with.
Not when it's cold, but she's amazing.
yeah.
She is. She's still Jean. She's set in her ways, and she doesn't like certain. It's just
As long as I don't,
Set in your
as
ways.
long
You
as I
know,
don't
Bud
park.
died.
No.
Oh my God.
When did that happen?
September 2 years ago. You know, Bud. He always went down to his farm to cut trees, and he didn't come home.
Oh,
And I was a little concerned.
so
'Cause he
he
didn't
what?
come
Just had a
home.
heart attack or a stroke or
Hit
something?
the tree.
He got hit.
No, he couldn't move as quick as he used to.
The tree came down.
Yeah, he had a great big come on hook to the tree to make it go that way.
Uh-huh.
And it did, jumped off the stump.
Wow.
Killed him dead.
Well, you
Just
know,
like that.
that is really sad. But on the other hand, he was doing what he loved to do.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
and I think that's a good thing.
And he is
That
just
Sunday before he was already,
weird.
and he was,
But he was well into his 80s, wasn't
Yeah, he was 87.
he? Yeah.
oh yeah, and he was telling his biggest fear was having to go to
A
nursing.
nursing home. And 2 days
You're
later,
ready to do that.
but I called his son here. Well, I
Mhm.
called his son in California, and I said, I don't have bad vibes. Your dad hasn't been home. So then he gave me the son's phone number here, and I called him, and he said, well, this was like 11 o'clock. He said, I can't get there till like 4:30. And I said, well, it's going to be dark. I said, Lon and I are going down to the farm now.
Mhm.
And that's when he
So you
went.
found him.
I know. He was such a, I still
He
miss him.
was a great
He was
guy. He
He
was.
could do anything.
David really enjoyed him, and
Oh, I miss him.
yeah, I
Now
bet.
run into trouble, I got to figure out myself.
I keep waiting for him to walk around in the backyard because he always bought a dozen of eggs. And he could only use a half a dozen. So he'd always bring us a half a dozen of eggs. Oh,
Come
well.
over for dinner.
Yeah. Yep.
Huh.
And his son here got a divorce. And his son was living with him for a couple of months, and he couldn't wait
His
until
ex-wife.
his son left. Yeah, the ex-wife, they got a
She'd waited
divorce.
a whole lot more money.
Yeah.
What about let's see, Congles?
They're still there.
They're still there.
Yep, they're still there. She actually watches her grandkids like I used to.
Uh-huh.
They're younger. They're like 5 and 7, I think.
So let's see. Mandy still lives
Mandy still lives 4 blocks from us.
right down on
Down on
Stonebridge.
Stonebridge,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then in Colorado,
Yeah, Marcy. lives
Marcy
there.
lives in Colorado,
She
so
lives
she's still there.
Her kids are 14 and
You
16.
got 5 minutes, you better get ready.
I was thinking I give up my seat, someone. Nice crowd.
Yes.
Love that.
Yes.
Oops.
With,
Yeah.
with Lily. Or Ella. Or Chloe. Whatever they're.
Who those kids are.
Maybe with the cat. I had 2 of those.
Well, we might sneak out exactly at 3:30 to go see another story.
Well, they only stream for an hour. So it's kind of like 45 minutes presentation, 15 minutes of questions. We'll see
Okay.
how it goes.
Because we're going to try to go to another swim meet, though.
Got it.
But it's at Valley, so it's really
Close.
convenient.
Convenient. Yeah.
Good to see you.
Well, it's so good to see you.
Yes, and please stop.
I
Stop.
have wine.
All right.
Yeah,
We have a deal.
An incentive.
We have a deal.
See you later.
Okay. Thanks for.
They're in Detroit.
Yeah, that's why they're going to Detroit.
Well, they knew that. I mean, I don't suppose they could have even.
Well,
Queen, were they Queen, well, you couldn't even see the seats.
I didn't understand why they went to Detroit yet. They have the Bills.
I don't remember.
Sorry, I should ask. It is Bodensteiner, correct?
Yes, Bodensteiner.
I don't. My maiden name is Smith.
Oh.
So I always want to double check everybody.
No, it's Bodensteiner. You're good. Oh, that's right. Should turn that on.
I love how it comes on. I have to go grab the mic. Yeah, oh yeah. We're not quite at 2:30, are we? There's one chair here. There's a couple up front.
There's one chair there and one chair here.
Yeah. Hello. We're pulling out a few more chairs. There's one in the first row on this side, one on the second row that side. And we're pulling up some more in the back. Sit in the back row. That's where all the troublemakers usually end up. I can tell. Okay. Exactly. Can't do yard work. Might as well come and get educated.
That's right.
Are we okay, David? Awesome. Troublemakers in front. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Iowa Files. I'm Gail Brubaker. I'm the Executive Director for the West Des Moines Historical Society, and we present this free educational opportunity in partnership with the fantastic West Des Moines Public Library, with support from donors, members like you, EMC Insurance, who enables us to live stream and caption each one of these programs to watch later on our YouTube channel, and the Friends Foundation of the West Des Moines Public Library. So if you dropped $1 in the box, thank you so much. You're helping us provide education and outreach on a variety of topics. And this one is going to be interesting, isn't it? Our speaker, Carol Bodensteiner, was born in Maquoketa, Iowa, and raised on her family's dairy farm. After a long and very successful career in public relations, Carol has turned her immense talents to writing, producing a memoir of childhood in the Midwest, as well as works of historical fiction and research on the orphan trains. We're so happy that Carol is joining us here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail, and thank all of you for coming today. It's wonderful to see such a good group and to share these stories of the orphan train. Can you hear me? So, no? Is this on? I should have checked that. Is it on? Maybe it's not working. Is it working now? No?
No, keep sticking. I'll try it.
Is it working now? Yay! Okay, well, we'll try that again. I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming. The sun came out, and so did you. And the warm weather, you're here. I love it. So thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to come in here and share with all of you stories about the orphan train, which is a little known, but really very important part of not just Iowa history, but the nation's history. Little bit, okay. Oh, please, wait, there we go. There we go. Gail shared this, so I will not spend much time on it. But I have always been interested in Iowa's history. And when I was a writer for the Iowan magazine, I had an opportunity to write about the orphan trains and do more research. And I came to realize something that I didn't know, which was that I was from Jackson County, Iowa, clear over on the eastern side. And we had friends who lived in Delmer, Iowa. And there's a train station there, and it's been torn out, but the depot is up on top. And this little illustration along there is of a train and people on the train. And I always think about kids on the train because Delmer was one of those stops on the orphan train. Delmer, Maquoketa, in the whole area, eastern Iowa. So I really found it fascinating to learn more about the orphan trains. All of the people that I interviewed for my article for the Iowan magazine were the children of orphan train riders. Their parents had all passed on, and they were taking up the mantle of telling the stories, of researching the stories, because many of them didn't know that their parents were orphan train riders until it was too late to get firsthand knowledge. But some of them did. And so I'm going to share some of those stories today. Normally I take questions throughout, but because of our format today, I will ask you to hold your questions until the end. And I hope I will stay here as long as you want to talk about orphan trains, because I love it that much. So, but to set the stage, do any of you have orphan train ancestors that you're aware of? Not a soul. That's interesting. The last time I did a presentation like this to about half as many people, there were 4 people in the audience who had orphan train ancestors. So that was surprising. And also, I love to share get stories from them as well. So I find the orphan train movement to be just endlessly fascinating. It was the movement of children from the East Coast west, and it amounted to the largest mass migration of children in U.S. history. Trains were used to transport children for 75 years, from 1854 to 1929. So we used this method for quite a long time. It's estimated that nearly 250,000 children who were orphaned, abandoned, or given up by their parents made the journey west. Some 10,000 of those children came to Iowa. In fact, Iowa ranked 3rd among the states who took orphan train children. So our population at the time was grown substantially by children arriving in the state. The National Orphan Train Complex, which is in Concordia, Kansas, and I will talk about them more, but I really encourage you, if you have time for an overnight trip, to go to Concordia, Kansas and see this complex. But they suggest that 1 in 4 Iowans may have an orphan train connection. There were that many who now are part of our history. So I'd like to delve into this history by introducing you to 3 orphans who rode the train to Iowa. Put some faces on the tens of thousands of children we'll be talking about. I use the term orphan in the broadest sense because many of the children had living parents when they came west on the trains. So first we have Dorothy, and I'll just give you a little. We'll revisit these orphans later on in my presentation. Dorothy was only a baby when she came to Iowa on an orphan train in 1919. There were no records of her life before she arrived in Iowa. She may have been left on the street or left in a foundling hospital cradle. We'll talk about those. But this is this picture, and I have to say, no surprise, the pictures are old and the quality is not great. So those of you who were brave and took the front row will have a better chance of seeing them more clearly. But the picture here is of the New York Foundling Hospital. The nuns there took in babies, and there were a lot of them. Okay, Bill Nelson was 8 years old when he landed in Maquoketa, Iowa. Bill is the little boy in this picture. His father had given him up to the orphanage, but he kept Bill's older brother, Arthur. Arthur is the older boy. So one was kept, one was sent off. Viola Volker was 3 years old when her mother contracted tuberculosis and was placed in a sanitarium. Viola's father couldn't care for the 3 children, with 3 daughters, so he placed the girls in an orphanage. He kept his son with him. 2 years later, when Viola was 5, she rode the train to Iowa. So children from infant up to teenage years were riding the trains. So we'll come back to these 3 later on. Dorothy, Bill, and Viola are just 3 of the children who took part in the massive migration of children. Viewed from with our eyes today, with the support systems we have, it is difficult to understand why all of these children would have been put on trains and sent out to who knows where. So we wonder how it could have happened, and we need to look at that. Step back, put your mindset into 1880s, and we'll take a look at the forces that were in play at that time. In the 1880s, immigrants crowded U.S. port cities, particularly New York, though other cities suffered the same migration congestion and associated problems. In its biggest year, 1.5 million immigrants came to the United States, 1.5 million. In 1880, the population of New York City was just over 500,000. Over the next 70 years, the city's population grew to 5.6 million. Iowa had only become a state in 1846. Population increased as land was settled. In 1854, when Orphan Trains started, Iowa population was roughly 326,000. By 1929, when Orphan Trains quit running, Iowa's population was roughly 2.5 million. So these immigrants, the picture here is of a ship, and it is crowded, every inch of deck space, with people who were immigrants coming to the United States. The immigrants faced serious economic problems in their own countries and looked to the United States with the promise of jobs and prosperity. Often the hope that they moved on was not realized. Living in New York, this picture is a tenement apartment. It's a one-room space for a family that you have to kind of look for them, but there are 5 children and 2 beds. The stove is over here on this side, and there's a closet. The bathroom would have been probably outside. And so all this family of 7 are living in a small one-room apartment crowded with 2 beds, the stove, everything in that space. The streets and tenements were just crowded with these large families. Poverty was rampant at the time. Healthcare was poor. Workplace accidents were common. Sanitation was minimal. Diseases like influenza and tuberculosis were widespread. Women died untimely deaths during childbirth or from disease. In this time period, America was involved in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and World War I. So that was taking men out of the workplace. They were going into war, leaving families frequently without a male adult in the family. The welfare system and child protective services did not exist. So the support systems that we have today, whether we agree with them or not, were not available at all in this time frame. So as a result, tens of thousands of children often wound up on the streets. In fact, it was estimated that at one point, 30,000 children were living on New York streets. And that was in 1950. These children were considered surplus children. That's how the term that was used for them at the time. So kids sleeping on the streets. As I mentioned, only about half were actually orphans with neither parent living. Orphanages also took in children who were placed there by their parents, and the parents paid for their keep there. The intent being perhaps to come back and get those kids when they got on more solid footing. Some of them did. Some of them were permanently placed. The parents would sign away the rights to the child because they just couldn't handle it. We also, as those of you who watch Call the Midwife on public television, know that we didn't have birth control either. So large families were the order. Also, children were court appointed to the orphanages when they were picked up off the streets and taken and put into an orphanage. So, whatever reason, whether they were abandoned, orphaned, whether the babies were just left out on the street, hoping that the police would find them, or just recognizing that they might die, placed there, court appointed, they were there. Other approaches had really unfortunate consequences. Parents left babies on the streets. Frequently, the babies died, or the children were abandoned to fend for themselves. And this small children, whatever, so they became pickpockets, beggars, prostitutes, the newsboys. How many of you have heard of the newsboys? There have been movies and plays and so on about them. They were a significant political force at the time. So our eastern cities were America's version of Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. You know, we were doing essentially the same thing. So children lived as best they could. They were not without gumption and resources to earn their own living. From the age of 4, they were out earning their own living. And it's important to know that society had the viewpoint at the time that children could and should work. So when people saw children hawking newspapers or working on the streets, they weren't shocked that children were working on the streets. Children should work. This was the moral point of view of the time. And so it was not as shocking as we might think it would be if we saw it today. The newsies, these young children who sold newspapers, they lived together, they staked out their territory, they were politically active, they were paid pennies for the newspapers that they sold when the publishers did not want to pay them as much as they were. The newsboys sort of struck. They organized, they got politically active, they didn't stand for it. And So that's a whole other story. And let's see, I have books up here you can take a look at, but this particular one was written by a Minnesota, this book was written by a Minnesota author who studied the newsboys in particular. So, but public concern did arise eventually over these children on the streets because they were adopting degenerative behavior. They were smoking, they were cursing, they were acting like the adults they were forced to be. And so, but there was also crime. There was vagrancy, there was prostitution, there was pickpocketing, there was all of these things going on. It just didn't look good, you know. So when you're the Vanderbilts or the Astors or the Carnegies and you're going downtown to the opera, this is not the city that you want the public to experience when they come to New York. You know, this is not good. So many organizations stepped up to help with this situation with the surplus children. Two in particular were instrumental in this effort. One was founded by Charles Loring Brace. He was a young Methodist minister. He was born in Connecticut in 1826 to a well-to-do family. He moved to New York City in 1852. His family wanted him to take a parish somewhere that would be respectable and whatever, but he felt that his calling was to the streets of New York. So he took the humanitarian efforts to the streets. He envisioned a publicly funded, non-denominational agency that would work with these children. And he founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853. The Children's Aid Society was organized to benefit the interests of the children, find them jobs, give them an education, provide reading rooms, train them, offer training programs. And he provided lodging for the newsboys. So even the newsboys who were totally competent in their own, he found a place to let them be housed off the streets. His goal was, he had programs like, you see these young girls who are learning to cook and work in a kitchen and manage a kitchen. So he was preparing them for their future lives. There were farms where the kids would go out to the farm and learn farming. There were a number of different programs that were designed to really help the kids become productive members of society. That's what the goal was, teach the children to be productive members of society. Donors stepped up to help, like the New York City elite, the Roosevelts, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the Astors. They were helping as well. Charlotte Astor, for instance, gave $1,500 to buy clothes so that the kids who went on the trains would have a new set of clothes to go on this adventure with. And so they would look good when they were being placed out. The railroads were engaged in this. They had a self-interest here, I will say, but they also stepped up to that because we were settling the West in this 1800s. We wanted more people west. And so the trains, this was in their best interest to get people west. But they would reserve a car specifically for these children that were traveling. And they would do that at no or reduced cost. The ultimate goal, of course, get the kids off the street, out of the orphanages and into homes and help them become productive. A second organization that was instrumental here was the New York Foundling Hospital. Foundling hospitals, it was established by the Sisters of Mercy in 1869. Actually, the Children's Aid Society and the New York Foundling Hospital, and a number of other organizations I'll mention, are still operating. So if you Google them, you will find them. And actually on that point, I have lists of resources that if you want to do more research, I've got lists up here that you can take and pursue. There have been hospitals in Europe since 1787, so this was not a new concept. What they did was to put a cradle outside the doors of the organization, and anyone could give up a child, no questions asked, no problem. From 1869 to 1959, they cared for more than 107,000 infants this way. So there was definitely a need. Now, Iowa, as some of you may be aware or remember, has a safe haven law, which is essentially this, that if a parent needs to give up a child, they can do it without there being any criminal follow-up or charges or anything. So because of our other systems, we don't have as much of a need as this, as they did here, but still a need even today. Since 2002, in Iowa, the Iowa Safe Haven Law has taken in 40 children. Okay, there are many other organizations, not all in New York, who got involved. Foundling Hospital and Children's Aid Society were simply the largest. The New York Juvenile Asylum, the Minnesota Home Society, the New England Home for Little Wanderers, which I love that name, was in Boston. Chicago Home Society, the Salvation Army. There were a lot of organizations that got involved in this. But even with all these organizations, the numbers were simply overwhelming. There were too many children to be housed and handled in these organizations. So they sought other solutions. And here's a dining hall of one of the organizations with children lined up at tables with their bowl of gruel. I don't know. But why the orphan trains? So there were too many children to keep in New York. And they wanted to give the children a chance at a better life. There was a need for labor on the frontier. So this business of children can and should work was part of the basis for the orphan trains and the movement of the children. They believed that there would be a stronger moral foundation for the children to grow up in the West than there was in the big cities. So that was a key principle of the orphan trains. And they also recognized that people were not going to come to New York to adopt a child. This wasn't going to happen. So we need to take the children to them. And placing out, as it was called, was tested out on the East Coast before it was instituted as a national effort. So they would take short train rides up to the agricultural areas of New York State, for instance, or other Pennsylvania ag areas. And that worked out pretty well. So they felt that they could go further with it. Oops, did I do something? Okay, so how did it work? We'll start with the New York Foundling Hospital. New York Foundling Hospital worked through the parish priests, and they would have the priests work with their parishioners to see who wanted to take a child. So parishioners could specify what they wanted in a child, male or female. Do we want what color of hair, what color of eyes? What people were attempting to do was to adopt children who were going to look like them. There's enough of a stigma attached to being an orphan that if they could come in as a small child and be in the family and they looked the same, it was going to be easier, which is logical. The New York Foundling Hospital required families to care for the children until they were 18 years old. They could come as indentured children, so that they were there specifically to work. It wasn't that we may keep you in our house, we will keep you in our household, but you're not our child. So, or they could adopt. So the numbers are unclear on how many chose which route, but that was the approach. The Children's Aid Society did things somewhat differently. They were focused on farms, homes, businesses who needed child labor. And because, again, work was considered fundamental to body and spirit. So if the children were in a working environment, this was going to be good for them overall. They did require that children get a Christian education. That was a premise. They were not indentured, but they were not necessarily adopted either. They were supposed to be cared for as though they were a member of the family. It worked for some, and it didn't work for others, but that was just in general the plan. The Children's Aid Society sent their first train to Michigan. Reverend Brace knew a minister there, so the families were screened. Later they placed ads, which I'll show you some, in newspapers along the train route, and people were invited to come and choose an orphan. The demographics of the children mostly were American born, so these weren't children who came in with their families who were immigrating to the United States. 94% were English, German, and Irish. Less than 1% were Italian or Jewish. Catholic children were only moved through Catholic organizations. So Catholic children were not placed in families that were not Catholic. There were almost no Chinese, Native American, Spanish, Turkish, Slavic, African children. And this reflected the attitudes of American society at the time. Who was worthy to be saved? And it wasn't the ones in that last bullet, in that second bullet point there. And also, I think I've only seen one record of a Black child being placed through the orphan train. But again, consider yourself in the context of the time. We just got out of the Civil War. Blacks had just been emancipated and lived through having their children taken from them and sold away. They were keeping their kids with them somehow, no matter what. They were keeping their kids. So different perspectives, but it was interesting to me to get that, what was society's perspective on who was worthy to be saved. It's a little uncomfortable. So they placed ads. And so wanted, homes for children. We're going to be in Troy, Missouri on Friday, February 25th at 1910, or homeless children. The Children's Home Society is going to be, let's see, where were they going to be? I don't remember. But what they did was they would have a local committee that was selected in each of these towns. And that local committee was charged with screening the people who would want to take a child. So that was their local effort to make sure that the child would be well treated, that was going to a good home. So the New York, the Children's Aid Society was really relying on these local committees to make sure things went well. There were agents who traveled with the children. So there might be 15, 20, 30 children and 2 agents, sometimes 2 women in this case, and sometimes man and a woman but these agents tried to check on the children at least once a year. So they were responsible not just for placing a child, but then for making sure or trying to ensure that the placement was a good placement. So that we left them and never checked in on them again. Many of the agents formed really lasting relationships with their children because they truly did care what happened to the children. When they would get to a stop, let's say Maquoketa, Iowa, the children would be put up for adoption. I think this has to be where this term came from, putting a child up for adoption. Because literally the children they had two sets of clothes. They had their everyday clothes, and then they had the nice clothes that maybe the Astors had bought, subsidized for them. But they were dressed, they were clean, they were dressed, and they were put up on a stage. Could be in a church, could be in an opera house, it could be someplace where people could actually see them. And the children were asked to say their name, to maybe recite a poem, sing a song, smile, because we want someone to want you. And if it's only if you make them want you that you will be adopted. So after the children then are put up, then people could come forward and talk to the child. It's, again, another uncomfortable aspect of these adoptions. If a farmer was looking for someone who was going to work on their farm, they would check out their muscles, they would check their teeth, they would do things that they would do if they were if they were acquiring livestock. So one of the agents that we know a lot about what happened with the children, because he kept copious records on every placement that he did. And he placed children in Iowa in 1898. He started doing that before he was actually employed by the Children's Aid Society. He could be considered one of the country's first social workers, the caseworker. He was, but he placed over 1,300 children, and he kept letters from them. He wrote to them. He followed up as well as he could. And I'd like to, and his letters and journals and things are published in some books. Clark Kidder, by Clark Kidder. But anyway, Kidder's has an orphan train connection of his own, and he found this resource of letters and reports and so on, and he decided he was going to put it all into published form so it would be available, and we're fortunate to have this. Let's see. So we know, I'm going to read just a couple of places here. And this is from Lime Springs, Iowa, September 7 to 8, 1898. Anybody know Lime Springs? Okay, you know where Lime Springs is. It's North Iowa, right? Yeah. So anyway, the children placed were William Atha, Max Berreter, Amelia Engler, John Gould, Augusta Heilman, who was placed 4 years later at Spring Valley, or replaced, Spring Valley, Minnesota. Emma Heilman, who was also replaced 4 years later to Spring Valley. Ernest Heilman, August Keyerbeck, and a German boy. So he didn't have complete records on everyone. But in September, I arranged for a distribution for Mr. Trott at Lime Springs, Iowa. We had there a leading committee man, a Mr. H.G. Kaiser, who took a girl named Amelia Engler, who later on was replaced with a Mr. Newell in Walker, Iowa. She was a brilliant scholarly girl, and when I visited her, she recited her graduating oration to me, which was exceptionally fine. She married a man in her locality. Mr. Kaiser had taken another girl who was also ambitious, and she graduated from Lenox College in 1907 and taught school in 1908. In some respects, this was a successful placing, and several were destined to become prominent in life. A few others had a rather tragic life. William Atha was replaced and fell into bad hands. They worked him fearfully 7 days in the week and half-clothed him. I went after him, compelled them to buy him good new clothes, and then brought him home with me and placed him at wages near Dodge Center. I would have sued for his wages had there been a lawyer in the town, but it was probably well I did not. One evening at the end of the season, he came to me well-dressed, saying he was going up into the lumber camps in northern Wisconsin. I begged him not to, as he would learn profanity, drinking, and other bad habits. For there is no refining influence of women there, and they are a profane set that smoke and drink. He said, I told him, go off into Iowa somewhere and attend high school in the winter, working for your board. He did so, graduated at high school and went to the Pella Baptist College and wrote me saying he was going to study for the ministry. He graduated as I received his graduation card, but I guess he did not enter the ministry. Once or twice he wrote me, but then stopped. Though I had put him on his feet and been his salvation, he never thanked me or showed me any attention in reply to my interest in him. It is satisfying, though, to know that he did not go to the logging camps and he had a fine education. So that's one example. And then this is now in October of 1899. In July 1901, I went to Sheridan, Missouri to replace. It's hard, I emphasize that because the way it's written in here, it says replace, to replace something. But he's replacing them. He's moving them from one placement to another placement. To replace two boys, brothers. I knew nothing of the boys nor the circumstances of their home and knew nothing of where I was to place them. I found them nice little fellows and with their foster father. The foster mother, I think, had deserted them. They were Henry and Frances B., aged 9 and 5 years. Securing a carriage, the foster father went with me towards Grant, Missouri, and we heard of a Mr. Marshall that might take the boys. We reached there about dinner time and mentioned our object and were told that they hardly cared to take the boys, but invited us into dinner, and we stayed. During the dinner hour, the family eyed the two homeless and motherless boys closely, and pity and love began to be manifested. After dinner, we were told we could leave the boys there a while and they would care for them for a while. They kept staying until the family could not give them up, and in a couple of years or more, Mr. Marshall wrote that they did not regret taking them and would feel very sorry to have to give them up now. I cannot recall where utter failure was made. Sometimes I had to board a child a few days somewhere and take him or her home with me, but the place opened in some way for a home for the child. How I would like to know the situation of each one now that all these years have gone by. So he was a very kind, generous man with a full heart for his mission of helping these kids. This is actually Dr. Clark, who was the H.D. Clark, who was the agent. But Homes Wanted for Children, he was going to be there at the Opera House in DeWitt, Iowa on Thursday. Yeah, so it's just interesting to find all these ads that are coming right into our state. As Dr. Clark says, people expect more, I'll read this, people expect more of an orphan child than they do of their own. The faults seem greater, are multiplied greater. I was sent to take away a boy for the awful crime of going in the cellar and sticking his fingers in some jelly. Would they send away their own child for that? Those who take a child and keep him or her will have a great reward. It is the rearing of a monument far greater than that made from marble or granite. So where did these children go? They went to all 48 states ultimately. The intent originally was Midwest. That was the plan, was Midwest, because they felt that was the best moral place. It was farming. It was everything that they were thinking would be right. But they had more children than they had placements in those areas. They were definitely rural communities along the train lines. They did not go into any large cities, so they would not have gone into Des Moines, for instance. Clearly too large, too many bad influences. In 1929, the laws changed, ending the transfer of children. And the last orphan train ran to Texas in 1929. So a lot of social things happened. Child labor laws changed. There were many influences that changed to cause the end of the orphan trains, at being a possible way to solve the problem. So since the Orphan Train movement, there have been more laws implemented related to labor relations, child labor. Adoption and foster services have been created. Public education has improved. Healthcare, nutrition, vocational training, all kinds of programs have been put in place to make the orphan trains not necessary. So let's go back to the 3 orphans I introduced you to in the beginning. Our baby, Dorothy, was adopted by Emma Peer, who was 46 years old. She had gone, as many people did, when the orphan trains came to town, it was kind of like, this is what we're going to do today. We're all going to go just see how this works. You know, so people would show up just out of curiosity. Well, Emma was curious, but she was also childless. And she took that baby home with her. She took Dorothy home. Her husband didn't know this was going to happen. He was not happy. But Dorothy became the delight of the family. And Dorothy never did know anything about her birth family. So that was her life. She was adopted as a baby, a great situation. Bill, who was sent on the train, his first placement subjected him to hard labor. And the agent who had placed him there discovered this and took him out. And so they looked for a place for him to go, and they found a widow who would take him in, and he stayed with her until the Depression, and then she could not afford to keep him anymore. So he was then on his own at the age of 15, and he farmed in Iowa for the rest of his life in eastern Iowa, family, children. Bill's daughter did the research and found his brother Arthur, and they went out to the East Coast to where Arthur was living, and the 2 men, who are now in their 80s, saw each other again for the first time in all of those years. And both of those men were carrying that very same picture with them all the time. So yeah, got to appreciate that they got together at least somehow. Okay, Viola and her 2 sisters were put on the train. They went to Clear Lake, Iowa, where they were separated. And Viola's daughter, Mary, learned after Viola's death that her mother had ridden the orphan train. And I don't know how she learned about this, but in the following 20 years, Mary did a lot of research on the orphan trains, and she started doing presentations to educate more people about the orphan trains and her mother's experience. These 2 dresses, the one on the right is the everyday dress that Viola had when she came out on the train, and the one on the left is the fancy dress that was going to be the one when she was put up for adoption. Well, Mary knew about that little dress on the right, and Little Orphan Annie had been her favorite story her whole life. And she wanted to wear that whenever there was a chance to go like to a school event or Halloween. She always wanted to be dressed up as Little Orphan Annie, and her mother let her. And only after her mother died did she realize that her mother was in fact a Little Orphan Annie, and that dress was a real direct connection to that orphan past. Mary got a whole lot of information, including the adoption document, because Viola was adopted by her family. This is Viola and her new sister, Chloe, and they had matching dresses, and it was this was her dress for the picture. And here is Mary sharing the story of her mother and the orphan train. And I had a great opportunity to present with her once. Someone had asked me to come and present, and I said, you know, really it shouldn't be me. It should be somebody who had a more connection with that. And I found her, and so she presented with me, but she was only able to do it once because she was starting to experience dementia. She felt uncomfortable about her ability to remember enough to do it. So, but I at least got once with her, so that was great. So it's estimated that half the children actually found good homes. So there was a real upside here. But about half also had less than desirable experiences. As coming up to today, I don't know if you listened to Mo Rocca, but he did an interview with the last known, he's on CBS Sunday morning. He did an interview with the last known living orphan train rider in Texas at the time. There are none in Iowa that we know about, but as adults, the orphan train riders became everything that any of us become. There are governors and congressmen, sheriffs and district attorneys, bankers, lawyers, housewives, farmers, you name it. They did all the same things that all the rest of us did. So why don't we hear more? This is a lot of people who come to presentations. Well, I kind of know about it, but I never, we never hear anything about it. And so why not? The records were not well kept. Fortunately, we have Dr. Clark's information, and there are quite a few books that have been written, memoirs and so on of family members or even the orphan train riders when they were still living. But there was a stigma attached to being an orphan. And particularly if you're someone like Bill, who wasn't an orphan at all, but was given up by his parents, this is not a story you're going to go telling a lot of people about. This hurts too much. So that living with the rejection of being given up, many didn't want to disrespect the people who had taken them in, so they didn't talk about it. And that generation is not a generation that talks about things like that. So, it was easy for people just to say the past is the past. We're not talking about this. But the National Orphan Train Complex, which I mentioned over in Concordia, they continue to do research into the orphan train riders and developing information. They have these artifacts, little things. The kids weren't supposed to bring things with them from New York or wherever they originated. It was considered, let go of that. You're going to a new life. Don't keep any of these things. But the kids sometimes did, so a little doll or that little elephant toy. So they've been able to collect some artifacts like that of kids who hang on to things. Knowing anything about the orphan trains is a result of Mary Ellen Johnson, who started the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America in 1986. She started interviewing people. She'd heard about it. She started finding people who had ridden on the trains. She was interviewed by 60 Minutes. And that's when things really took off, because then people, well, I know that person, they did that, I know that person. So people started to contact her, and she got more and more, and she published them in what was at least 6 volumes now of orphan train riders, their own stories. So they, and then there was a national competition to see where the orphan train complex would be. Did this quit? Quit? No?
This guy.
No batteries. I will talk louder. How about that? But Concordia, Kansas won. And
I'll replenish the battery.
and I need to get to questions. But anyway, they continue to do research, and they share the stories. They have a Facebook page, and they place statues around. So people who have an orphan train family member that they want to commemorate, if you go there, you've seen in various cities where they have, well, ears of corn or cows or pigs that have been, or bears. In Berlin, it's bears. But they have all these orphan train statues, which are just terrific. So, and then a little description of the family member that they're commemorating. So, it's on the northern edge of Kansas. It is about a 5-hour drive from here.
South of York, Nebraska,
people know where that is.
Which Nebraska?
South of York, Nebraska.
South of York, Nebraska. Yeah. It's not a difficult drive, but you can't do a day trip over there. It would be an overnight. But they also have a terrific historical museum. So there's a lot to see there. Okay. The Children's Aid Society sent 60% of children to towns between 1,000 and 3,000 people. The New York Foundling Hospital has not been open with their records, and they remain not open with their records. So we don't know much about where their children went. It took, if you compare it, yes, I've been back online, compare it to our current foster system. Today they say that it takes 7 years for a foster child to find a forever home. So I don't know that that's different. Children in foster care are taken and replaced, hoping to find someplace that will be forever. So it's difficult either way. Let's see. Jackson County, Iowa, their historical museum has quite a bit on the Orphan Train. And here are other resources. So, and there are novels, terrific novels about the Orphan Train. Christina Baker Clark wrote one of the most famous ones, and she went to, there remains an Orphan Train reunion. Now it's all the kids, but the Orphan Train reunion in Kansas every year, and she just went and hung out with those individuals and got their stories. And then she wrote a novel that has achieved great acclaim. The Chaperone, they're children's books, Train to Somewhere. So there are a lot of books. And then, of course, stage plays, musicals, things of that sort. So anyway, I was supposed to stop talking 10 minutes ago. But I would take questions. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I could. And remember that I have a handout sheet if you want it. It's quite a while ago, wasn't it?
It was actually just.
Oh, did I miss it?
At the end.
There we go. Okay. All right.
And how did you happen to get interested?
Well, because I was freelance writing for the Iowan magazine at the time, and knowing that I kept driving past the Delmer train station, I pitched that idea and was able to write an article for them on that. It was, and that just made me more interested. The more I found out, the more interested I became. So, yes, other questions? Yeah. Well, it could be several days, depending upon where they were going. At least a couple of overnights, and so they would stay on the train overnight, and it was a challenge for the agents when the trains would come to a stop, because of course the kids would want to get off the train, but then rounding them back up to get back on the train could be a challenge. But I think the food, I've often wondered what they ate, because the agents would be responsible for some food. And apparently mustard sandwiches were pretty popular. And so they weren't getting first class meals here, but they were getting something. And sometimes, because the orphan trains were such a phenomenon, and the media covered them. The media covered that very first picture of the train with all the children that was up when you came in, with children all lined up and whatever. These were publicity shots. The media would take pictures like that to go with the articles that they were writing. And so the point of that is that when people knew when these children were going to be coming through their towns, but sometimes the townspeople would put together food that they would give the kids. So, yeah.
So every train that left, would they have a specific destination?
They knew where they were going. Yes, yeah,
How long?
yeah, because they were placing the ads to let the people know, well, okay, we're going to be in your town on X date. And so come. Because
Would they always find a home for all of them?
they did not always, and this, if they went to the first town and all the children were taken, great. If they weren't, anybody who was not taken, they would go to the next town. And then they would go to the next town. And preferably, hopefully, by the end of the line that they'd set up, they were all gone. But sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they took them back to New York. And so, this is a traumatic, this article, this little children's story, which I have a hard time even thinking about without getting tears in my eyes, is about a little girl who believes that her mother is going to be at the next stop. Every time, my mother will be there, she'll come get me. My mother will be there, she'll come get me. And she, on the last stop, there's a woman there, not her mother, who wanted a boy. I mean, that was her goal coming there. And they agreed that neither one of us wanted this, but we're going to love each other anyway. So, yeah. So.
Trains went to like Wisconsin and Minnesota, Iowa.
Yeah. They went to all the Midwest states, and then eventually to all the states, all the contiguous United States. So they were in 28 states, and there are records of some getting up into Canada and into Mexico. So they branched much further than they originally intended to. But they're as the orphan train complex gets more information, they're starting to recategorize how things happened, because let's just say it was a 15-year-old girl who needed to be replaced. They might put her on a train let's say she's in Concordia, Kansas. Let's just say she's in Concordia, Kansas. Well, they have found a place for her in Kansas City. So they will put her on a train and she'll go to Kansas City herself to link up with the family that she's going to be with. So there are different words now coming into play for people who are on these original orphan trains, the long haul ones out of New York and Boston and wherever. And then also these interim small spur replacement trains. And those were pretty common as they're finding out as they do more research. Yes, ma'am.
I know how they feel because I and 4 of my brothers and sisters, we were put up for adoption out of Burlington, Iowa. And my twin brother and I were raised together, and we would go to school, and the kids would kid us all the time. You guys weren't wanted.
Yeah.
My mother said, just tell them you were chosen. Your parents had to take you.
Mm-hmm.
We had another classmate that was adopted too. He was from, I think he was from a foreign country.
Yeah.
So they're kidding the 3 of us all the time.
So you can appreciate, children are children,
that's
and
what
they'll
they do.
be just as mean as they can be when they can get away with it, so.
Who's in charge of these trains?
Well, at the highest level, shoot. Well, for heaven's sake. The minister, Brace, Reverend Brace, was in charge of the Children's Aid Society. So he was a minister who had set up this organization. Now it was quite large, because he had the training programs, and he had farms out in the country, and that he was also responsible for, but ultimately he would be responsible there. And then the Sisters of Mercy, I'm guessing the Mother Superior who was responsible for that facility would have been responsible there. But there wasn't there was some coordination, but in some cases they did not work together. They had different beliefs about where the children should go and what they should do. So the Sisters of Mercy were very set on these children going into Catholic families. And there's some jokes that you may have gone into the system as a Jewish child, because these children that were left in the foundling cradles, they don't know what their backgrounds were. But you were going to be Catholic when you came out. And so you know, who knows? Who knows? But then because Reverend Brace's opinion about where the children and the work that they should do and things like that, he had his opinion. He wasn't coordinating so much with the Children's AIDS or with the New York Foundling Hospital because they had a different opinion. So no higher
When you
authority.
enter the building, please come to the second floor adult services desk. With me to the second floor adult services desk, please.
I may be finished.
Carol has offered to stay and answer questions, so we will definitely do that, just being respectful of our streaming time. Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
We are taking December off, so the next Iowa Files will be Sunday, January 13th. We're going to travel back to 1897. The general store in Walford, Iowa burns down, and in the ashes is found a body presumed to be that of Frank Novak, part owner of the store. But was it? You will find out. If you need something to do in December, the West Des Moines Historical Society is holding Home for the Holidays on Sunday, December 4th from 1 to 3, where the Jordan House Museum and Bennett School Museum will be open. We are decorated to the hilt. You should come see the gaudiness that is the Jordan House. It is awesome. In fact, have some folks here who are coming tomorrow to add even more stuff to their room. So please come. It'll be open also all December. And we will ask you to vote on which room you think is the best decorated. But that's Sunday, December 4th, 1 to 3. Tour both museums. We'll have family crafts. Adults are more than welcome to craft with us at Bennett in the basement, and I will be there talking about one-room schools. So thank you again to the Friends Foundation of the Public Library. The Public Library is awesome, and we thank them so much for everything that they do, EMC Insurance, and our members and donors. Have a good day.
Thank you, Carol.